Welcome back to Absolute Units, the official podcast of the Museum of English Rural Life. I'm Joe Vaughan, the museum's social media person.
And I'm Ollie Douglas, the museum's curator of collections.
Last time we finished speaking with Katrina Navikas about her upcoming book, Contested Commons. We talked about the history of enclosure and public protests for access to common land.
And we do want to bring Katrina back soon for another episode on a theme that, according to Joe, is very close to our hearts.
It's close to my heart.
Bins. Why are bins close to your heart?
They're in every home, aren't they?
And home is where the heart
Home is where the heart
and
is.
The bin.
And the bin.
Yeah.
So, ergo.
And they're outside the home too. Like wheelie bins and in the street. And sometimes.
So the heart can be outside as well.
Yeah. Sometimes in the countryside.
Bins. And that's what we want to talk about with Katrina.
Yeah, litter bins.
Who's done some work with Joe Lysett on bins. So we'd be very interested to get her take on that.
Yeah. So that sounds great.
Yeah. But today we're switching focus to talk about queer rural history and welcoming onto the podcast our former colleague, Tim Jerrome. Tim is now doing a PhD on queer rural history at the University of Brighton.
When Tim was with us, he worked initially in the archive team. He had a public-facing role in the reading room. And then he eventually came to work with me on the curatorial side of the museum's work. And I think it's really important to understand that because part of the really interesting thing about Tim's approach to his PhD has been quite heavily informed by his journey in heritage and the different roles that he's had within that space and the different ways in which those kind of forms of practice impact on his theoretical perspective or the way that he's approaching both finding and sharing the histories that he's interested in. For the most part, he's interested in same-sex relationships between men, historically, between, I think, 1800 and 1950. But we do, in the episodes that we've recorded with Tim, talk a little bit about queer histories more broadly, so thinking about LGBTQ plus histories in a much broader sense. So there's hopefully a little bit of broader stuff in there as well. And it was an amazing conversation, and it's going to be an amazing piece of work when Tim gets to the end of his thesis.
So in this first pod, we chat with him about his time at MERL, what he did here, some of the highlights of that. And then we go into how that informed the work in his PhD. And we touch on some of the things he's found. And we talk about those in much more depth in the second episode with Tim that will release in 2 weeks' time.
Yeah, what's really great is Tim doesn't talk too much about how much of a tyrant I am as a manager, because he did have me as line manager for a while, poor Tim. But yeah, there we go.
Enjoy. All right, welcome Tim to Absolute Units. It's very nice to have you back at the museum.
Thank you very much for having me, which feels like a weird thing to say, seeing as I worked here for many years and still feel like I belong here in a way.
You do.
And you're in here regularly.
And we lock the door. Yeah. We lock the door. You can't leave.
Yeah, you're in here regularly anyway with your research.
I am indeed.
I think that the arc of this podcast is probably going to be what you were doing when you were here, what you've been doing since you left, and then in the next conversation we have, we'll talk about what you've been finding and things like that.
So with that in mind, Tim, maybe we can take you right back to the first role that you had at the museum, and you could tell us a little bit about that and where your background in relation to heritage lies.
Yes, so I started off as a archive trainee. That was back in 2017, I believe. So I was supervising the reading room. I was doing a bit of cataloguing. I was speaking to donors about new collections. And that was all to prepare me for a master's at UCL on archives and records management.
Just very quickly for our listeners who aren't researchers, what is the reading room and what happens in there?
So the reading room is where all the archives are dished out to researchers. It's where all of the brilliant discoveries are made. There would be no point in keeping archives if we didn't have the reading room.
So you went away and then you came back again?
Yes. So allegedly I am now on the way to becoming an academic, but I would still call myself an archivist as well. So after I did my master's, I somehow ended up back here again, this time as a collections researcher. I was technically on the curatorial team, but I was this strange kind of weird hybrid that seemed to reach across the archive team and the curatorial team and the learning and engagement team.
Yeah, and as part of your role, you did some amazing blogs.
Yeah, so during the collections researcher time, I was extremely fortunate to have a social media team who were willing to let me get away with the most ridiculous nonsense possible, which I don't think would have gone off the ground anywhere else in the country. The first one was the Horse Wizards blog.
Horseman's Word.
Yes, the Horseman's Word, which was a real historical society, people performing magic with horses. The one that always sticks in my mind is the one that was complete fiction, which was the Tractor Whisperers blog. That was complete rubbish, but it was so much fun to write, and we kind of tricked people into learning a bit about tractor history as well.
For any listeners out there who are a bit worried about us peddling nonsense, I think this was all in the context of April Fools.
It was April Fools.
Yeah, sadly it was.
This blending of perhaps fictionalized narratives, historical fiction, and actual fact born out of the archive is a really nice way of thinking into some of the work that you've gone on to do. And actually, it's worth acknowledging that Tim is a published author with a work of historical fiction under his belt. He's a novelist as well. So, many, many hats, Tim.
Yeah, that was a good segue, Ollie. Well done. Into talking about historical fiction. No, I love doing that. It helps to fill in the gaps that are sometimes missing from the archives, to take people's everyday living experiences from other parts of their lives and then fill in the gaps with that. For histories like queer histories, like we're going to talk about, I think historical fiction can be a really powerful and useful thing.
So I think that's probably a really good moment to get into the real topic of this episode, which is your work as a researcher into queer rural history. Could you tell us about how you got into that? How did you begin your research into queer rural history and queer lives in the countryside?
So I suppose it probably all started during my master's, when I was looking into harmful content in archives. So words or images that turned up in archives or on archive catalogues that people were searching that they would find potentially offensive or upsetting, or that people wouldn't want to look at, or the same way words that institutions wouldn't want to be associated with at all, and so they may try and take those records off their catalogues and so hide those histories and make it more difficult for people who are researching marginalised histories to find those records. I became very interested in how harmful content was catalogued and addressed, and I did my master's dissertation on that topic. So when I then came back to the MERL as a collections researcher, part of the MO of the project that I was working on was to expand the museum's representation of historically marginalised communities in the content that we did and the displays that we did in exhibitions. And I sort of became very involved in looking out for marginalised histories and the people who are interested in them, which then led on to a flagship moment where everything changed in my career. And I went from an archivist who was happy putting things in boxes all day to someone who wanted to really make a difference in the field of queer histories. And that was an exhibition that we did called Queer Constellations in 2021. And that came about because of a promenade play that was going on at the museum called The Stars Are Brighter Here. And we wanted to basically do something with the collections alongside that.
For anyone who doesn't know, promenade plays are when you perform a play or a production that goes through a space.
And the Stars Are Brighter Here was a production led by a theatre producer called Tim Allsop, and it was a production made partly with the support of Torch, which is the Centre for the Study of Humanities at the University of Oxford.
Yeah, and as it goes, we decided with a few months to go until this play to have an exhibition in our Nook space about LGBTQ histories amongst the MERL's collections. We thought, that sounds nice and easy. We'll just need a few objects or a few archives that have queer histories related to them. And it'll be a very simple exhibition to put on, and what could possibly go wrong?
Narrator.
Next thing that happened, it went wrong. We were looking amongst our collections for LGBTQ histories. We were searching on the catalogue for any words relating to historical queerness that were attached to any of our records on our catalogue, in a desperate panic to find anything at all that could go into this exhibition to accompany this promenade play. And there was absolutely nothing. And there was an added element to this, which is that we were also going to have a display of contemporary artworks, which was curated by a Brighton PhD student called Joe Dukes. So they did a wonderful job getting together all these artists, and there were going to be all these brilliant artworks, and we were going to complement this with our historical stuff, which sadly didn't exist.
I guess there were a couple of things going on here at the same time, which were really helpful to what you then developed as a method to tackle this challenge. The first of which is that the main thrust of The Stars Are Brighter here was the telling of different brief micro-historical biographies about queer people, both from the past and the more recent past. So one example was Nina Layard, who was an archaeologist in East Anglia and well known for incorporating aspects of queerness both into her work, but also living as a queer woman in the course of her life in the late 19th and early 20th century. So examples like that, where you're taking a particular character, a known historical actor from the past, and using their story to encapsulate queer experience in a particular historical context. And the other really interesting project that was happening at the same time that kind of fed into your inspiration, I think, was a piece of work under the title Broken Futures. I wonder whether you could just describe what that work was and then maybe go on to tell us how that helped shape a way of addressing this absence in the MERL collections that you'd found.
So yeah, Broken Futures was a project that was going on with the Berkshire Record Office. Essentially, they were looking for records of people convicted of what were essentially homosexual offences, with male homosexuality being illegal in England until 1967. As the County Record Office, the Berkshire Record Office held all of those court records for those convictions. Broken Futures was attempting to recover those histories and portray them in a slightly different light and display them as something a bit more than a conviction, which is what we want to do to, expand these people's biographies and their stories and, just tell the public a bit more about them. So that use of those criminal records is something that we found to be quite inspiring. The way in which they were being used as not just saying this person was gay or queer because we find them in the criminal record, but that wanting to do more with their story.
And the other really significant thing about that project was it was in some ways a counterpoint to the story of Oscar Wilde, who is the most famous person to have been put on trial and criminalised for his sexuality and placed in Reading jail. It was looking at other ordinary people whose lives perhaps we didn't know anything about and hadn't heard of before.
When you mentioned that there wasn't anything in the collection to do with queer history, can we spell out a little bit more what it was that there wasn't? It's not the case that there were not queer people in the countryside, but it's more the evidence.
Yeah, so this is really interesting. And I think I perhaps almost carried some of my own bias from my harmful content work into this when I was looking for those queer histories, because what I'd taught myself is that to find queer histories, what you had to do is go onto an archive catalogue or object collection catalogue or whatever and type in all of these horrendous slurs and offensive words and words that essentially were used to demonise and criminalise queer people in the past, because I assumed that all historical records described queer people in this way. I used all of the different words that I'd learned during my time doing my dissertation, and I couldn't find anything at all. I did try more modern terminology as well, in the hopes that maybe some friendly, well-meaning cataloguer had at some point gone and put those words into some records so that I'd be able to find things a bit more easily. But it was the terminology relating to queer people and queer lives is what I couldn't find in the catalogue.
There's something else going on there as well, which is that by that stage in your career, Tim, you were working as much with object collections from the museum side of the collections as you were with archival holdings. Archival holdings are sort of records that have text within them, but that text is often not transcribed onto the catalogue. You've got a sort of description written over the top by someone who's gone in and tried to summarise what the content of that item might be, often in a very brief and perfunctory kind of way. With museum collections in a digital catalogue or database, there's a thick description there quite often, and sometimes that does include transcriptions of the documentation, but the documentation itself is a secondary form of description. So it's not that primary object and the histories that it encapsulates. It comes with a degree of bias, and it's the bias of past cataloguing. And that plays a really profound role in excluding certain histories and in erasing certain histories and foregrounding other ones. So I think coming through in all of this is a bit of self-reflection for us as collections professionals, that we need to be mindful of these other potential strands of history that are important and should be accounted for.
Yeah, and amongst object collections, it can be even harder to find queer histories than it is for archives. For that exact reason, we taught ourselves to search for queer histories through keywords, and that is what I've even been doing in my PhD as well. And often those keywords have been transcribed from the particular archive that you're looking at. I remember when we were looking for harmful content issues within the object collections, it was really, really difficult because an object, it's quite hard to describe what an object is really, but it's a 3D thing that is not primarily composed of text. So it's harder to make those searches on the catalogue.
It's not composed of categorization.
Yeah. So finding those histories from objects is going to be even harder, because even if you teach yourself the exact words to use to find those histories and archives, it's just where do you even start with objects? Because we search our catalogues, whether it's through our back end as collections people or on the front end as a public user. We search it through text. I mean, you can't really search through images, at least not that I know, or anything like that. So
we have to remember that the object collections here are stemming in the first instance from the 1950s. So the way in which they're catalogued reflects the norms and preferences of that time. And that's the moment during which the trial that led to the Wolfenden report and the ultimate decriminalisation of homosexuality happened. So it's a kind of key moment in queer history, but it's also a moment when bias and traditional ways of thinking are also fairly standard.
Ollie, for listeners outside the UK, would you just quickly summarise the Wolfenden report?
So the Wolfenden report was a report led by Sir John Wolfenden, who was, at the time he wrote the report, the Vice-Chancellor of the University of Reading. So there's a nice local connection there. It was exploring, well, I guess there was a prominent trial, but there were a number of trials trying people for acts of homosexuality in the mid-20th century period. Key amongst those was the so-called Montague trial, which convicted Michael Pitt Rivers for homosexual acts with Lord Montague of Beaulieu and others. These are significant figures. These are landowning figures, important people. Michael Pitt Rivers, for example, is one of the members of an organisation called Kinship in Husbandry, which is a kind of mid-century early organic movement. So these are significant people with land, with power. And the report was basically a process of overturning that criminalisation and decriminalising homosexuality. But I think the critical thing in terms of some of what Tim's talking to us today about is that this was homosexuality only with men. Is that right?
yes, that's right. So homosexuality between women has never actually been illegal. I believe it was discussed in Parliament at some point, as in considering making it illegal. But the government at the time decided not to do that because they thought it would give women the idea that they could be lesbians, and that they wouldn't have known that otherwise. As my research has shown, they did know that they could be lesbians, even without the legislation. So going back to queer constellations, the great kind of equaliser between the archive collections and the object collections is that we could not find anything at all in either of them that directly related to queer history. So we decided to take some inspiration from this Broken Futures project that we mentioned, which I should say was done in collaboration with a group called Support You at the Berkshire Record Office. What we decided to do was to look elsewhere outside of the museum for these queer histories and then use the objects in the museum's collection as an illustrative tool for their lives in terms of their occupations. So we used the British Newspaper Archive, which is a brilliant online resource that I'm still using now. It has hundreds of years of British newspaper histories from all sorts of publications, and it's readable as well in terms of, it's a thing called OCR, optical character recognition, where it can search every single newspaper for search words that you would put in. You can put in terms in which homosexual people would have been described in newspapers at that time, and it will show you all these results for people who are described under those terms. From that, we were able to find lots and lots of different people who lived in rural settings, who were from villages or who were tried in villages sometimes. from that, once we had their names, sometimes their ages, or any more details about them, we could then go to genealogy websites like Ancestry, for example, and use census records to find out what their occupation was. So we were doing the same thing as Broken Futures, really, just with a kind of rural twist and trying to find out what their jobs were so we could show them as more than a conviction.
So was one of your biggest sources police archives and case records?
So in this instance, it was newspapers reporting on court cases,
Right.
which they were always very, very keen to do because there was this great moral outrage over homosexuality. Obviously, crimes relating to sex were very popular in terms of readership. So they were always, if not front page news, they were always mentioned, whereas other crimes may not have been. Obviously, the court records that are held by the county record offices are also a good resource, but their collections don't tend to be digitised. Whereas the British Newspaper Archive is all online, so it was a bit easier to use for our research.
Do you have a sense, Tim, from the records you looked through of whether there's a disparity between reporting in urban versus rural settings? Are many more of these headlines urban, or are there also cases in rural communities as well?
There were cases in rural communities, which is why we went to newspaper reports for basically same-sex activity, because it was the act of sex that was illegal. But in terms of finding queer people through newspapers, there's so much more in terms of opportunity in doing that for people in cities, because there were reports of, for example, police raids on gay clubs and bars. There are newspaper reports on activism and marches in cities, which are a lot more difficult to pin down in the countryside. It didn't happen as much in the countryside, which is just the truth of it. This activism, these meeting spaces. That is one of the reasons why, when we were doing Queer Constellations, I decided to look beyond the museum in terms of secondary literature to see what has the wider academic world been writing about rural queer histories and how to research them, because obviously we're not doing very well. In terms of English rural queerness, there was also nothing there as well. And that was what really surprised me, the fact that rural English queerness just has not been researched, I would say comprehensively, but really at all, which just seemed like a huge gap in knowledge. That sort of research hadn't been done. But I do fully understand why, because the archival sources are so much more available for the urban sphere, not just those archives that I mentioned, but all sources of queer history. And it is also true that a lot of the people who are writing queer history over the last several decades have generally been from an urban background themselves, and so have been more inclined to write histories of their own experiences. So even going beyond Queer Constellations onto why I wanted to do my PhD, that kind of gap in knowledge was really significant.
I think there's something else interesting going on there, in that the main focal point for gay activism and gay rights activism has tended to be an urban one. We think often of particular places that are meeting points for queer people, nightclubs, bars, that get a name for that community being welcome there and safe there. They tend to be in towns and cities. Even if you are a queer person in the countryside, your chances of meeting other queer people in your community are relatively slim compared with going to urban centres. I'm reminded again of The Stars Are Brighter Here, and in order to accommodate the promenade play in the galleries, we took a certain gallery in the museum, which at that time was given over to telling the sort of fascinating story of the Museum of English Rural Life and its history. And we removed some of the content from that gallery, and it transformed briefly and wonderfully into a queer nightclub, a queer rural nightclub, actually, from a small country town. And in another gallery, there was a mock-up of a supermarket. These are meeting points and places for sharing queer histories and experiences that are in some ways neither rural nor urban. They're spaces that unite everyone. And it sort of begins to break down that barrier of studying urban history on the one hand or rural history on the other. These are spaces that people move between.
Yeah, and please don't ask me the question of what is rural.
Oh, it's been on the tip of my tongue for about 5 minutes.
There are specific definitions of what is rural, and that tends to be about the numbers of people living in a particular centre. Beneath a certain number of people, it's considered a village, and therefore a rural community. Over a certain number, it becomes a town. But really, people are moving between those spaces and places anyway.
I was going to say you could do it by the number of livestock, but then obviously if you go back to the 19th century, there were more horses in London than in the countryside or something.
Yeah. So,
Yeah.
livestock, not a good indicator of
Not a good at all.
rurality.
No.
Yeah.
But when it comes to queer histories, it sometimes almost feels like anything not in London is rural, because all research so far has been so focused on London. Even other cities have been a little bit overlooked. I've generally been going with sort of market town or smaller to count as rural, but I'm sure some people tell me off for that.
It's worth noting that you mentioned Joe Jukes earlier, and they were involved in curating the other side of the exhibition, which was all about queer rural experience as articulated through contemporary arts practice. And the main thrust of their PhD research was centred on the queer rural experience. So there are other researchers working in this space. They're not necessarily working on the history. And that's really where the main thrust of your work lies. You're taking us back, I think, to 1850, or is it even earlier?
It's slightly earlier to 1800. But there is so much wonderful work going on in terms of documenting and tracking and thinking about queer histories in the modern day. And that's even something that Queer Constellations did. All of the artists who were involved in that came for an event, which I believe was captured in a short video, which I think is on the MERL YouTube channel.
We can put a link to that in the show notes.
Yeah. And that was really brilliant, bringing all those people together to discuss their experiences and thoughts of their sexuality and rurality. What I was thinking throughout was, this is wonderful. This is happening kind of in the modern day. And this is also a heritage institution as well. So there must be potential to do more. And the collection that really caught my eye, the one that I was itching to get into, was the collection of farm records that have been one of the longest standing collections in the MERL archives. They started being collected in the 1960s. And I just didn't have time to go into it. So I thought, wouldn't it be wonderful if I had 3.5 years of doing basically nothing else, so that I could thoroughly immerse myself in these farm records, which 99% of them are pretty boring, but 1% of them are amazingly interesting to me.
And I think we're going to talk about that more in the next episode.
Yes.
Talk specifically about what you've been up to at University of Brighton, which I'm very excited to learn about.
I think that's a really nice moment to pause and reflect on work to date, on how to identify and speak to queer histories in the archive. There's been some work on this from other scholars, not necessarily looking at the rural, but finding ways and routes and methodologies to try and identify people in the past with different sexualities. How do you find those? And how does that contrast with what's often seen as a kind of neutrality in terms of the archivist voice and the way in which archivists are expected to catalogue things? I think this comes through in curatorial practice as well. We don't dwell on people's sexuality. We don't make judgments one way or the other. So it inevitably results in an absence and a lack of focus on those questions and histories.
Yeah, so this is something I find absolutely fascinating, and I want to discuss with as many archivists or anyone else who wants to listen as possible, which is the fact that archivists are taught to be neutral in their work, and they're supposed to portray the past exactly as it was. They're supposed to have the records in front of them that they're cataloguing, and essentially to summarise exactly what they can see on that record and put it in the catalogue for people to search. And the issue with that is that often queer histories come through in archives in ways that are not obvious, that are not just written down in front of you. Because, of course, if you're writing a letter or a diary at a time when homosexuality is illegal or, in terms of women, heavily stigmatised, you're not likely to openly reveal your sexuality in these archives in such a way that is obvious to even to an archivist or to a wider audience. So what they do is they use euphemisms for people who are in same-sex relationships, or if they are homosexual themselves, the way they feel about people is going to be written in euphemisms. One that comes up again is saying things like, my kindest friend, or chief among my kind friends, or my most intimate friend. Words which obviously don't apply today as LGBTQ labels that we would give to people or that people would identify as. But they are very strongly indicative of a same-sex relationship going on. So what does an archivist do when they see that kind of thing that suggests a same-sex relationship, but they can't be 100% sure that there is one. And that brings the whole issue of speculation into things. And that is something that archivists are very wary about, which I completely understand, because you don't want to misrepresent people. That's especially true when it comes to something like homosexuality, where in the past there were certain terms that were used to mean both a same-sex relationship and bestiality, for example. They will both be used to describe the same terms in the kind of criminal courts. So if you saw those words, then you wouldn't even necessarily be sure which of those two things have been going on. It can also be a very isolating and quite a scary thing to do as an archivist or a curator, especially if you're trying to do it by yourself, to deal with these big issues and just being frightened of getting it wrong, basically. And that can lead to you not doing anything at all, which then leads to things not showing up on the catalogue and those histories staying hidden.
I suppose there's professional pressure in terms of archivists' objectivity and accuracy, but also there's institutional pressures, there's societal pressures depending on the era you're in and the social context. So I can see it's very challenging from the archivist's perspective.
Yeah, and it's also true that every archivist has a different opinion on this, because archivists are taught to be neutral, but there's also a kind of growing feeling of, neutrality is all a myth, and it's kind of the least important of all the archival tenets. But then it is also mentioned in the Code of Ethics of the Archives and Records Association quite a few times. So it's no wonder that archivists get confused.
And we took you, Tim, from a role working solely in archives and thrust you into a context of curatorial practice, where in the wider museum sector, it's been recognised for quite some years now that museums aren't neutral and that we all have this bias and unconscious bias in the way that we both catalogue, interpret and share the collections that we're tasked with caring for and looking after. You were kind of caught between a rock and a hard place in the context of the projects that we were asking you to do. I wonder whether we might go on briefly to talk about what came next. So after building connections and before you went away, you were integral to us applying for further money from the Museums Association SB Fairbairn Collections Fund for a project called Further Afield. In some ways, that project was attempting to find a new route to tackle some of these challenges about how do you talk about absence, how do you address absence, and how do you find ways that are perhaps not so isolating. So you're not just a lone curator or a lone archivist trying to deal with these issues on your own, but maybe working in community-led ways. I wonder whether you could tell us a little bit about the basic framework of Further Afield and where LGBTQ plus histories fit into that.
Yeah, so this was a project that was all about community outreach and participation in the museum. It was almost a sort of a case of redressing the balance in terms of us being unable to find anything relating to these marginalised groups in our collections, or very little at least. Perhaps we could work together with community groups who were related to certain protected characteristics. It wasn't necessarily just about getting new things for the collections that related to these protected characteristics. That sounds very sort of cold-hearted. But working together to kind of do some events together and spread some awareness and help groups that didn't necessarily feel as welcome in the museum because of that lack of representation, help them feel more included, and then tell everyone else that we were kind of open for business in terms of working with these community groups.
And open for things other than business, I suppose. Just people who can come and enjoy the museum.
Yeah, that's true as well. So, I mean, my involvement was influenced by the fact that I was approached by Mark Curry, who was and still is the chairman of the Rainbow Canopy Group for then the Forestry Commission. Now I think they're called Forestry England. He came to me before this Further Afield project. He came to me because of Queer Constellations, and that's something else about Queer Constellations. I get asked sort of, why is this work worth doing? What's the point? And just anecdotally, Queer Constellations had more feedback, more engagement than any other exhibition I was involved with, both at the time and for years afterwards. Mark, who was involved with the Forestry Commission, approached me and basically said, will you give us a talk on queer rural histories? And have you found a queer lumberjack at some point? I still haven't found the queer lumberjack. That's something that I've been tirelessly searching for. So Rainbow Canopy and as a wider whole, Forestry England were one of these groups that we decided to work with for Further Afield. And the whole project has been has been wonderful. I was only part of it for a year before I swanned off to do my PhD. But really, really glad that we did it. I'm really proud to have been a part of it.
As always, Tim, you're selling yourself short because you continue to be supporting the project even today. We have recently installed a small community case display in the museum of the outputs of some of the events that Tim was involved in developing with Mark and with Rainbow Canopy. It's resulted in a display that also draws in some of your current research as well. So it's a nice sort of coming full circle. Just a little addition there, the other two partners in that project further afield are Inclusive Farm, which is a farm established by a blind farmer and which works to make careers in farming and food and that sector much more accessible to blind and disabled and neurodiverse people. And the other partner organisation is Dadimas CIC, which is an organisation founded by Geeta and Subhash Ludra. Originally, its main purpose was to provide opportunities for South Asian women to experience the natural landscapes of the Chilterns, so making those more inclusive and accessible. And the work that we've done with Dadimas through Further Afield has been focused on refugee and migrant communities in Reading and opening up the collections in different and more diverse ways. The work with Rainbow Canopy continues, and that's a legacy of your having been involved in establishing that project, Tim, and we're hoping that that'll continue to develop in ways that identify a queer lumberjack and maybe lots of histories of queer forestry moving forward. So thinking back to the start of that Further Afield project, I'm reminded of the fact that you wrote a really nice blog post that summarised some of those broader aims about working with other stakeholders and communities to hopefully better embed their histories and their experiences in the work that the museum does moving forward. There was an immediate backlash and quite a visceral and unpleasant one from some quarters of society. I wonder how you feel that connects through to the work that you're doing now. Is there a relevance there? Is there a value and importance of what you're doing in relation to that?
Yeah, well, I think it's worth saying that that what backlash there was, it was from a more of a traditional media area, whereas I think the response we got on social media from our kind of regular audience and regular followers was much more positive. And in general, the kind of vibe around the project was very, very good. But in terms of the backlash that we did get, essentially it just made me even more determined to do this research and keep uncovering queer histories, because, well, I mean, what better way is there to refute these sort of feelings that this work isn't worth doing, other than being able to hold up a letter that I found that shows a queer relationship going on a farm in the 1880s. That's the evidence, and it's in the archives, and that's why it's so important, so we can continue to use it in these conversations.
And I think that's a pretty good place to round up this episode. So next time we'll be back with Tim talking much more about the stories he's been finding in the archives so far, how he's been identifying queer relationships and queer people, and the techniques used to explore these people and their lives based on the limited evidence available. Thank you so much, Tim, for joining us, and we'll look forward to speaking to you again next time.
Yeah, thank you very much. I look forward to coming back.
Every week forever.
See you next time. Thank you so much for listening.
Thanks for listening to Absolute Units. Your hosts have been me, Ollie Douglas, and my colleague and producer, Joe Vaughan.
Absolute Units is made possible by the support of Arts Council England and Museums Partnership Reading, our partnership with Reading Museum.
If you're enjoying the pod, please leave us ratings and reviews wherever you're listening and share it on social media, because all of this massively helps us reach new listeners.
Massively. So we'll be back in 2 weeks' time with Tim again, chatting much more about what he's found.
Yeah, and he's found some really cool stuff in farm diaries and farm records, and we're looking forward to hearing more about them.
We also ate quite a significant amount of cake between the recording of episodes 1 and episode 2.
Yeah, and Tim brings cake, so, he's popular with colleagues or former colleagues.
So there might be talk about cake.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's not a requirement for visiting researchers to bring cake with them.
But it is encouraged.
It is encouraged, yeah.
Anyway, thank you so much, and we'll catch you next time.
Bye.